Hello, labdien, dobry dzień, labadiena, und guten Tag. A warm welcome to our discussion on democracy and its enemies, how not to lose the battle, organized by the Foundation DOTS and the Robert Bosch Foundation. Leitni lūdzam mūsu diskusija, Demokrātija un tas ienaidnieki, nezaudēt, cīņā. The discussion will be in English language. Ja, diskusija būs angļu valodā, bet tiks nodrošināts arī tulkojums latviešu valodā. Vai kam ir vajadzīgs tulkojums? Tur mūsu kolēģiem ir austiņi. Citādāk mēs tagad sāksim runāsim angliski. But I will quote a second time Latvian language for this discussion. A sentence which goes very much to my heart. Bez cīņas nav uzvaras. No victory without a fight. This is a slogan designed, it's very important to know, designed by Ansis Tirulis for the Latvian rivermen in 1917 when they fought for Latvian independence against the Bolsheviks and the German troops here in Latvia. And we are very much supported here in this city by Estonians, by the way. There is a fight for democracy. There is a battle. And it's worth to fight it and to win it. Democracy is fragile. We can lose it gradually and then suddenly without even noticing. Politics of enmity, ego-driven communication, toxic public discourses, populism, political violence, and misinformation have become a new reality for us in our liberal democracies. And on top of that, Russia's war in Ukraine has created a new security reality for us in Europe, not any longer in peace. And consequently, our democracies have become even more vulnerable to external manipulations. And our societies and our governments are less open and more ready, limiting civil freedoms in the name of national security. We are already in a decade full of turbulences. But how do we weather the storm? What are the dangers to our democracies that we need to watch out and before it is too late? And I'm very happy and I'm very glad and proud to introduce our three honorable speakers to you. A very good friend of mine, Professor Karolina Wigora from Poland, historian, sociologist, and also journalist, and member of the board of Kultura Liberalna Foundation, which is also the publishing house or the publishing institution for Kultura Liberalna, Poland's leading online political and cultural weekly magazine. And with a lot of titles and experiences, she was also a Bosch Fellow some years ago. She's here with her son. And I see also other children here. It's also worth fight for their future, for democracy. From Lithuania, the second speaker, Vytis Jurkonis, is that right? Okay. The project director at Freedom House and head of the Vilnius office of Freedom House. 2 years ago, in 2021, you received the title European of the Year by the European Movement in Lithuania, which I think in Lithuania is still an honor. In some other countries, including my home country, Germany, it might be difficult. And last but not least, a very high pleasure for me to, I don't know if I have to introduce you to the audience, but nevertheless I will do this. Jānis Zārts, director of the NATO Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication, expert in security, defense, and cyberspace questions, several times rewarded for his work for Latvia and the NATO. And colleagues in Germany asked me that I have to have a look on the socks you wear, because you are famous, but today no socks. I expected that you have again some nice socks, which makes the Russian ambassador a bit crazy. But before we start a discussion with the panelists, I would like to invite you, the audience, to use your smartphones. Yes, usually we ask you to switch them off, but please use them, because we do a small Slido, more or less. If somebody could help me here with the technique, because this Slido screen is lost. Wait a second. Ah, okay. Usually we should now have some advertisement, but okay. So we will ask you a question. And it should be on the screen. Yeah, so please fill in what are, in your opinion, the biggest threats to democracy in our time. And we could see it also here on the screens before us. And of course, also the speakers are invited to take part in this. So I still give you 20 seconds. So there are 3 in the lead at the moment. With your participation, you could change still the ranking, so this is also kind of democracy. Okay, final chance, and I will close this now. And we lost the words. This is funny. But I think it was disinformation, populism, and dictatorship. Okay. Thank you very much. So they are again. But the first question to my speakers is, please take out some of the threats mentioned by the audience, which are from your perspective, or especially from your organizational background. Yeah, we have a NATO office, a supranational organization. We have a publishing house, the media, and we have a think tank, a global think tank, might be the most important ones. Yanis, would you like to start?
Well, I think for me, the biggest threat to democracy is the men and their instincts. If I have to say one thing that really threatens. But in more kind of elaborate terms, I think there are at least 3 layers that we have to discuss. Disinformation per se is not a new phenomenon. What is the new phenomenon is where we consume information, which is social media, which is instead of in a traditional democracy where media were the guardians, gatekeepers of information to be kind of objective as much as possible, the bias is taken out, factual elements are being pursued. Right now, our information world or world perception is created in the social media, increasingly so, and thus the algorithm is the king of what we see. And as such, that is where my point. It feeds human instincts, it feeds human vices, and therefore disrupts an ability to discuss, communicate, agree within a society. One. Second I'll mention is we're entering globally the era of the competition and conflict of systems, that being democracy versus autocracy. We see it in Africa, we see it in Asia, but I have to say we see it also here in Europe. Let's take a look at Georgia, which was a rising star some years ago about the, transformation into the democratic society. What's been happening in 3 last years? They're becoming really authoritarian systems. So that is a global fight that we're having.
Just one question regarding your last remark on the competition between systems. Actually, wasn't it for decades a competition of systems, and it was only interrupted for some maybe 15 or 20 years by the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the communist system?
In a way, yes, we're back to that, what was happening, but I think from a slightly different angle. In that world, as we remember, that was capitalism versus communism. As I remember in my childhood, I was told in a TV, 2 programs that were available. But right now, it's not really about, like, autocracies are happy to be, I'd say, corrupt capitalists, but the way to govern is what they really want to have it different. And the reason it is a fight, because they're afraid of what is the power of democracy and what and how this democracy can make their own citizens to challenge authoritarian leaders. Is it in Russia? Is it in China? Is it in many other places?
Thank you. Vitis, the slogan of Freedom House is expanding freedom and democracy.
Correct.
Yeah. Frankly spoken, maybe the trend is going at the moment in a different direction. Not at Freedom House, of course, but globally. There are more autocratic regimes than democracies, and almost 80% of the world population lives in these autocratic regimes. Taking this and some of the words by the audience, what are your analyses on this?
I would pinpoint the fundamental word in the process of democracy, which is trust. And I think that we are taking many things for granted, especially in the democratic countries, that democracy is an irreversible process. That's changing, but for the last decade or so, I think most of the Europeans were too lazy to actually care about democracy at all, because they thought that they were taking it for granted. We were rather sluggish in this in our foreign affairs as well, saying, you know, like geopolitics first, you know, military, whatever, and democracy, you know, a priority, usually number 6, number 7. So meanwhile, the authoritarian countries, as it was told, they were fighting us. And we were not even defending, we were observing how they were fighting. And that's, and there are at least like 2 dimensions. One dimension, when we look to the foreign affairs, so the authoritarians are actually at the battle, and they are trying to impose, seed doubt, mistrust, and all of that, do divide and rule. Meanwhile, the most of the transition countries, they think that, well, give us the candidacy status for Euro-Atlantic integration and we'll ensure you democracy. That's not how it works. It should be actually the reverse, and we hear that very often. And somewhat in the Baltic countries, for instance, generally in the Vilnius stand group before there was we were doing homeworks, reforms, and processes like pro-democracy process was driven mostly by the external factors. And once we are there, as I told, there's okay, so we shouldn't be taking care of that. It's going to be automatic. And as we see in processes like Hungary, that's not the case. And therefore, the most important thing is, and aside to my Freedom House work, I started working at Freedom House mainly because of Belarus. And people were asking, why do you work in Belarus? Belarus is so boring, it's so stable, nothing is happening there. And I was explaining, guys, you know, I live in Vilnius, 30 kilometers to that side, not the other side. And I understand how lucky I am, because I know many Belarusians who have to fight for their freedom. And we saw the beautiful protests in 2020, which ended up like they ended up. But living so close to the authoritarian countries, I understand that we need to cherish democracy and not take it for granted as some Europeans would do.
I think Belarus is an excellent example. I would like to ask you also a second question on this. I could fully follow your argumentation, But one could also say, oh, let's have a look on Belarus. It's not so crazy here in Lithuania or in Poland or in Latvia if we have some restrictions in our public freedoms, for example.
Well, I totally disagree, and I hear that because that's usually, what the authoritarian countries feed us, and some people are misled with this whataboutism, constantly seeding doubt that, maybe democracy. Obviously, the other element, which is very important, that like we tend to be very perfectionist, as if, if we have a democracy, there's nothing to criticize. On the contrary, when I work with the Belarusians and Russian Democrats, usually they are talking always about unity. Democracy is about diversity, about the ability to listen to each other, to trust each other, to respect the other opinion, to be inclusive. So I think that when we talk about this unity, in times of war, as in Ukraine, obviously, unity is of critical importance. But in times of peace, I think the ability, to promote diversity, to listen, not only to listen, but to hear each other, is of critical importance. And when we have disinformation, when we have various troll factories and all of that, I think that that's where we are losing it. Authoritarian countries do it deliberately. They're looking at democracy as a weakness, though I think that it is a strength, our ability to have a conversation and to get to a point where we start trusting each other.
Trust, Carolina, is a very important foundation for a society. And I would like to ask you the question, especially with a focus on the democratic culture we need. Some of the words here which really came into your mind, others you expected and you couldn't find on the screen?
That's very interesting. Nobody wrote, someone said, but nobody wrote as an answer to the question, what are the biggest threats to democracy in our times? Nobody answered here, we are. You said that, and quite rightly. I mean, this is nothing new, right? It has been already described in the ancient times. According to Thucydides, democracy is extremely fragile. So we are every time the cause of it. You said human nature. The question that should be added to that is, when does it happen? What clicks? What changes? So coming back to Thucydides, there are a few factors that are omnipresent also today. Turmoil and change, the factors that make us feel anxious about what is happening to us tomorrow. Pandemic, war. So we have all the possible factors there playing, very active. And I think we should start with this, because the anxiety that is being produced by also all those factors is so big, so large, that people actually forget that in their interest, in their vital interest, is democracy and not autocracy. So you have this beautiful quotation from Montesquieu, who writes in the 18th century that people basically have passions, and those passions tell them to do nasty things, but luckily they also have interests who tell them not to listen to the passions completely. But in those times of turmoil, we have a reversal of that. So people basically listen only to passions, and they forget about interests. The balance is gone, and hence not trust but distrust is the center of our social world today.
And coming back to the competition Janis mentioned at the very beginning between countries and between systems, sorry. Could you see an influence from outside of our societies to destroy this trust?
Are you asking about Russian imperialism? This, of course, was mentioned here, and quite rightly. I mean, there are at least two factors. There are external factors and there are internal factors. Of course, being in this region, we feel very well. We don't we don't know it with our thoughts. We know it with our feelings, with the emotions. We know that it has happened before. And thus, we understand that the war that has been caused by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine is something that is very dangerous also for our democracies, also for what is happening with us, and that the war can spill over Ukrainian border. This is something that is simply in the veins of people who live in this region. This is one thing. But also, I think we should remember, of course, populism is one of the biggest words there, and also quite rightly, right? Because democracy is also being destroyed from the inside. Someone said once that power corrupts, right? And total power corrupts totally. But listen, some of them today are afraid of losing power, and this corrupts you absolutely. So this is even more.
Okay. Janis, as a social media expert, and I try to follow your Twitter account a bit, and some months ago you made a comment on your yearly check on the social media companies' resilience to bot manipulations, and you wrote, if that would be an exam, it would be a fail. So what could be, or what would be necessary for companies, not states, not governments, to develop more resilience, that we could use the freedom they offer and do not go into the trap of the threats they bring with them?
Yeah, isn't that a paradox, that something that promised so much in a sense of social media being such a force for a democratization and an empowerment of people turned out to be such a spoiler? And in fact, we just finished the other check on the social media companies, and we were really looking at what happened with Twitter post Elon Musk took over. So the news is, since Elon's ownership, the bot amount has not really, it increased, but not much. But what increased by 60% was Russian propaganda reach. So even just the ownership change with the different values, or I would argue non-existence of those, in my view, would shift it in such a way, especially during the times of war. But more kind of back to your question, I think that we're facing two problems. Social media are driven by technology and the commercial instinct on the one side, and the technology is very fast. So the way algorithms work, the way they monetize our attention on social media, and the way they actually affect the way we're increasingly into the echo chambers or information bubbles, increasingly unable to hear, understand, or relate to other points of views, is one part of a problem. The other part of a problem that we, as someone said, we still have a 19th century kind of governance model, and that governance model is not made for the pace of technology. So in an essence, for social media, what we have a Paleolithic brain of people, we have 19th century governance, and godlike technologies. And the combination of those three doesn't work very well together. And that's the essence of that. So what we should do, I think we have to really look at costs we should put on social media if they don't perform in line with the democratic standards. And frankly, even the regulation that EU has passed, they're not really living up to it. Anything happens? Nada, nothing. That's one problem. The second problem is social medias come and go. Like, used to be Facebook was big, now it's all about TikTok. So we have to ensure that every next layer of social media would be much more hard-pressed to live up to the democratic standards. Because the other twitch that we have to remember, we kind of are used that social media come out of the democratic world. So the engineers and designers kind of have had democracy at school, but it's changing. Increasingly, the engineers and the ones that are behind the controls would have had an authoritarian system being taught at school. And that is also coming in. So, yeah, we have to be faster in regulation. We have to follow up with a consequence. And we have to raise the barrier to anyone become a global social media company, so that the ones that don't meet the kind of democratic basic standards couldn't make it.
Thank you. Vitis, again, with your experience in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, and the other post-Soviet non-European Union countries, let's call it this way, isn't it again a paradoxon? If we talk about regulations, restrictions, control on the one hand, to stabilize our democracies, and on the other hand, we need the freedom of expression and the social media and all these channels to foster democratic movements in authoritarian countries.
Well, you know, if you talk to the Democrats in Belarus or Russia, one problem that they would highlight would be the big tech, because their battle is now like in the social networks at YouTube, basically because they are pushed out of their own countries, and it's very difficult to reach out to the ordinary people. So the problem of the big tech exists here in authoritarian countries as well. We know that countries like China are building the China wall, creating their parallel structures, their own social networks, and it is a big debate and a big challenge. At the same time, you know, what bugs me, and that's a conversation that I have with my colleagues in New York and DC, you know, whenever we write a report, Nations in France and Freedom in the World, we are constantly weeping and lamenting, you know, yet another year of decline. And, you know, and in this conversation, we are also talking about how we are attacked. And there's nothing positive, as if we are basically building a graveyard for democracy. And I think that that needs to change. We need to talk about things which are positive within democracy. And, you know, the other paradox is we are sitting here talking about all the problems and challenges, how we are attacked. And, you know, some Belarusians in 2020, you know, a country which was doomed for most of the people, saying well, it's so boring, it's so stable, nothing would happen. The people there, despite all the risks, they demand a change. And I think that we also need to see this, that the demand is there despite all the risks, and that's where we need to be much more stronger and efficient in our foreign affairs as well.
Yeah, if I might jump in, I think the way I formulate, and I agree that we talk a lot about the problems, but I think that is exactly what makes us strong.
Yes, no doubt.
And in a way, when we talk about the issues and the attacks, etc., that is all true. There's not much of talk of what is a problem with authoritarian systems because they are afraid to show any of it. And in my world, authoritarian system is never as strong as it looks, and democracy is never as weak as it looks. And that's the logic we have to apply, but we still have to talk about the problems.
That's correct. But from the public perception thing, when we are talking only about the problems, it seems like we are not only on the defensive, but that we are losing. And I think that that's a wrong perception, that we need to show examples of the inspiration and also stand by what we are declaring. Because when we are declaring that human rights and democracy and fundamental freedoms matter, we need to show it. We need to actually not only do the talking, but also when, you know, for me, the question, if we come back to this Belarusian question, is like, so what have we done regarding Belarus in 2020? We were shaking hands, saying Živie Belarus, taking photos with Svetlana Tikhanovska, but were we like determined enough to make sure? And you know, Vladimir Putin was looking, if you cannot do anything with Alexander Lukashenko, who is a relatively weak dictator, then I can do whatever, you know, and I think that that's also a very like issue that we need to understand, where like the dictators, they think that we are weak, that we are not going to stand like a...
Let's ask Putin now, huh?
Okay, so I like this very much. Carolina is sitting here making notes. And the guys are talking, but I really would like to bring you back into the discussion.
I'm always the person who listens to sides
and then find the conclusions. And as I promised, we think about solutions for the future. If we, coming back to this, for the last time, to the whole social media question, and coming back to our democracies, our liberal democracies, which competencies are necessary for citizens to survive in our digital age?
This is a very good question, because social media have good sides and bad sides. This Zuckerberg revolution, how it is called, has as much good sides and bad sides as the Gutenberg revolution. Listen, one of my expertise moments in history is the 17th century. Those people in the 17th century in Europe were basically living through an age that was created by the Gutenberg revolution. It was the long-term effect of the Gutenberg revolution, a century of revolutions, religious wars, of burning Giordano Bruno, and of Descartes. So it's all there. This is our time. This is our time. So what competencies do we need? Well, first we have to learn to say the truth, because social media means not only truth but also lies. And it is important to be on the right track and not to let anyone to push you out of this right track. And also, let's remember, social media trolling is something horrible. I have experienced some this week due to a certain text in the New York Times. I can talk about it later. But listen, in Belarus, they can take you out of your home and torture you. So listen, there is a difference, right? I mean, of course, trolling is nasty, but nobody's coming into your house and takes you and your wife to prison, right? So, and we have seen in the past few years what Belarusian authorities are actually capable of doing, including kidnapping planes, right? So listen, truthfulness, courage, but also let's remember that it's really not the same as in Russia or Belarus. And I have been also thinking, you have been talking about this, let's not let people think that they have already lost. But listen, this is ongoing struggle, right? We have to remember that it's an ongoing struggle. Nobody loses, nobody wins. It's just, if not today, then tomorrow, democracy will be stronger here and there. And just to end up, because you have been talking about overthrowing Lukashenko, basically, and I think this is a huge aim. It's very difficult for us here sitting that anybody does anything to do it. But, you know, in my life I had two political moments. The first political moment was filled of really child hope, and I say child because it happened in 1990 when Lech Wałęsa wins the first presidential elections in democratic Poland. And all the children were living the emotions with their parents. So I also lived the emotions with my parents, and I was jumping around the room with joy saying, Wałęsa won, right? So this is my first political moment. This is my first political initiation, so to say. But there is also another one. When I have my first son, and we are in Warsaw, and I have my son in a trolley, so I can be like, what, 30 plus? And I see that some a company that builds houses have made a fence so that they can build a building. And I know that this is not a place where a building should be. And then I have this political moment and I say, I will not tolerate this. I cannot tolerate this. And listen, we have gathered 2 angry mothers with trolleys and with babies, and we have contacted the authorities of the district, and we had got away with it. I mean, we have got rid of this company of the district. So I think we should perhaps remember that it's not always about overthrowing Lukashenko, okay? It's about every day and what are actually the things that make you think, I will not tolerate this, I have to act. And listen, only 3 angry mothers were enough.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I would really like to come back to our countries and to our region a bit, and also to our societies. And I also would like to introduce to the audience something where you could follow up your country and the development of democracy. There is a website, it's by IDEA International, and it's called the Democracy Tracker, and it's for the first time you could have a view on a monthly update on the development on democracies worldwide. And just to give you 2 very small insights, maybe we have a look on France. Anybody here from France? Très bien, okay. And then you see this is a red one, and why it is a red one? Because then you could click on this. Oh, this is Pakistan, sorry. No. I try to keep it still in Europe. So, okay, France. And then you could see why it is red. It is here that the social integration of people with disabilities, it's a very broad spectrum of democracy, is insufficient in France. And you can check this human rights and also political equality. So you see this is much more than only the freedom of speech or the right to go to vote. And maybe we have also a look on a positive example from a country in the neighborhood. And this is, it's Moldova. And it's positive because Ilan Shor, one of the oligarchs, was sentenced. And this is a proof for the rule of law and also for the fight against corruption. So I hope you will still listen to us and not to have a look on Latvia and Germany and Lithuania, by the way, it was red. This is the cliffhanger or the spoiler for the next discussion. Vitis, the question to you, working for Freedom House, one of the institutions making these similar reports, annual reports. How useful do you think are these trackers, these websites, these reports for stabilizing our democracy?
Well, I'm also lecturing at the Vilnius University, so as for academic and for my students, it's very good, especially when you see the dynamics, when you can compare. And I think that's also and when you can compare different countries, because sometimes when you are in your own country, in the bubble, you might talk only about the problems and see only the problems. And the example I was making about Belarus was not that it's only the big things which matter. Totally not. But for instance, that was said very rightly. If we talk about the LGBTI rights in Lithuania, right? There are things which, obviously, which are not well, which need to be fixed. But again, comparing to what? If you compare to the Nordic countries, that would be one situation. If you compare to the neighboring countries, be it in Poland or be it in Belarus, then you might feel the situation a little bit different. So therefore, I think the analysis, especially if that's done really well, with all the nuances, also picking up on things we see a positive trend. Why is that so? So you picked up Moldova, that's okay. Would Shore resonate to Lithuania? If you are not into the eastern neighborhood, probably not. But see things which are developing in your country in the context is very important, but also in the historical perspective. Because in 2004, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and the question is why 15 years or 20 years after, there's not so much of the enthusiasm. And Some of it is there in the screen, but most of it, as it was said, lies in us, in our confidence, in our perception of what democracy is. So research is great, but for democracy to actually flourish, we also need action.
Carolina, we talked about trust at the very beginning, and we see that trust in institutions and processes as well in our democracies is dwindling. And many citizens find their expectations of participation and justice are not being met any longer in societies. And there is a feeling of being underrepresented in the democracies, and this might be also a threat, because it's a threat to our societal coexistence. You already mentioned your article in New York Times. I would come back to another book from you, you wrote it with Tomasz Telikowski. The Polish title is Polka Ateistka kontra Polak Catholic. We could translate it, but I think it's obviously, so the Polish atheist against the Polish Catholic.
I'm the Polish atheist.
Oh.
Yeah. I'm the Polish atheist.
Okay.
He's the Polish Catholic.
That's fine. But you talk about this for Polish society is one of the main cleavages. How important it is for us to identify the cleavages in our democratic societies to strengthen the rights of people and the participation of the citizens?
You know, I think that defining cleavages is very important, but as long as you also define what is common for the people on one side, on the other side. And it's crucial because this book that you are talking about, this book contains 11 discussions on things like abortion, euthanasia, LGBTQ rights, etc., etc., etc. And we basically, when we sat to write this book, we knew that we wanted to discuss 11 controversial subjects. We knew that we would be very different on most of them. And we were very different. For those of you who know the name Terlikowski, that you will know that he has become very famous in Poland because he was opposing any kind of abortion. And when the total ban in 2020 was decided, many people accused him of doing it, even though he's not a politician. He's an intellectual who, by the way, has the right to his views. So we were discussing fiercely in the book. But what we discovered on the way was that actually we have a lot in common. So this is about, for example, the fact that we both believe that life is a fundamental value. Now, we can interpret it very differently, but when we discussed abortion and euthanasia, basically we understood that we both defend life, only in very different ways. Now, again, another example. In Poland, nowadays you basically cannot have abortion. But if you have a child who has a severe disability, you will not be helped apart from some very scarce financial help. Now, we both agree that this is a disgrace. It should be changed as soon as possible, no matter that we disagree on the subject of abortion. And I think, so I think it's very important to understand for democracy also that those people who think completely different about the world and values and also about the law and what it should allow us or not, those people are also our citizens. And if I have a dream of a better Poland for the future, I have to be sure that this guy here in the first row will perhaps work with the kids of my friend Tomasz Terlikowski. Perhaps he will be their student. Perhaps there will be his bosses or something like this. They have to coexist together. We will not, send half of the nation to the moon. And this is the core conviction for a well-functioning democracy. We are different. We have to co-live together.
Thank you. I think this is the the first answer how to strengthen democracy. Before I open now the floor to your remarks, comments, and questions, Janis, the last question to you, also about the book, and again a Twitter post 2 days ago from the Riga Stratcom conference. You posted, oh, fun fact, today 8th of June, by the way, this is also my wedding day. This is the day when in 1949 George Orwell's 1984 was published. So now I'm a bit afraid about my wedding day, but and still relevant today. 1984 is the book which described that the system is already set, and it comes from inside. What could we do to show more resilience against the enemy from inside? We talked a lot about Russia and China and threats from outside coming to our societies. But if we see how easily in countries like Poland or Hungary you could change the constitution, yeah? Just an example. What could we do to be aware of this?
I think the core of fruitful, successful democracy is the exchange of ideas and ability to hear the other story's side. And I think what we have increasingly lost, we have our own ideas, but increasingly are deaf to the ideas of the other side. So exchange is getting more and more difficult, and that is, I think, one of the fundamentals of flourishing democracy. I'll not go back to the reasons, which is, as I've said, social media and the kind of monetization algorithms and et cetera, et cetera. So what should we do? I think first, there are some good models. Like we talk about trust being lost in a society. Yes, that's in general happening everywhere, but there are some exceptions. Finland stands as one of those exceptions. So why shouldn't we look at what makes them like still resilient and able to trust each other, trust the government and the state, and even trust political parties? You can imagine that in a circumstances where like the rest of the dynamics elsewhere is, I think there are other elements of the societal fabric that are still functional. And I think that is where kind of we should be looking back in a way, doing something extremely opposite. And I would in a way argue this is doing the opposite. In a sense where everything is digital, we kind of go back here, discuss, build sense of community, have a sense of belonging to the group in a basic sense. Of course, all of the Latvians will remember very recently, we had it like 2 weeks ago, taking a bronze medal in ice hockey also helps. But look for those elements that kind of bring you together and kind of also built on those. And I think that is where is still a potential where we can work on.
Yeah, great. And I think this is the reason why we are here, why LAMPA exists. And it's easier, I think, for us to come every year to Cēsis than for the Latvian team to win in each championship at least the bronze medal. I would highly appreciate it, even silver or gold, but maybe this is, it's for us, it's easier to come into a dialogue here and not to have a free Monday after the weekend. But now it's up to you, please. Here is the mic, Ražas Latvia, made in Latvian. And so I see the first question, I throw it to you, and you please introduce yourself very briefly, and then your comment, your question, your statement.
I think, oh, sorry. This will be more of a comment or a question, I don't know. But what do you think that we maybe aren't like wary enough of these people who like say anti-democratic things? Because I think often we kind of forget about this like paradox of tolerance thing, that you're like, if you're tolerant of the intolerant, then in the end your society will turn intolerant. And I think it's the same that like, of course everyone has a right to an opinion, but in a democratic society, we cannot allow these anti-democratic forces to like take hold, because they will take hold very quickly. And I think we can see also like worrying things happening in the United States, which also I think comes to the same problem where they have these anti-democratic parties or politicians, and they kind of believe in the strength of their democracy too much. I think that they place like too much trust in it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we collect some comments and questions. I think this is a very important one, the tolerance or intolerance against or towards the intolerant.
Hi, this is a question and concern at the same time, that on this stage, and often we hear about that we need to implement change, we need to be efficient and all those things. And nowadays, the efficiency is the king of everything. And if the country is efficient and fast moving, then it succeeds, and if not, it isn't. But democracy is slow compared to autocracy. And my question, that's the concern, and the question is, do you see any ways that democracies can get more efficient without losing the basics of democracy?
Okay, could you hand over to the very left side from my side?
Yes, well, I have a related question, actually, slightly related to efficiency. I recently spoke to Fiona Hill, who, as you know, is mostly focused on security risks to democratic resilience, and she is currently researching the issue of social marginalization in regional inequalities. So, and that to me is not a coincidence. It's a very central question. To some extent, the 6th of January events in the States also were about people who see themselves as the losers of globalization, of the economic processes, to do with that, having revenge on the liberal elite as they see it. So the question is, can we actually solve the issue of threats to democracy without solving the fundamental underlying socioeconomic issues, where increasing number of people feel disenfranchised?
Okay, thank you. So it will be a second round of comments, but I think these are 3 really heavy questions. I ask you to give short reflections on this, because otherwise time will run out. But so who will start? We have the question on inequalities, on efficiency of democracy, and on intolerance in democracy.
Why don't I start with this first question? I thought about an anecdote about Georges Clemenceau, who was asked after the First World War, what do you think people will remember about this war, the First World War? And he says, I don't know what they will think, and I don't know what they will think about the responsibility of Germany, but I know one thing, that they will never say that Belgium attacked Germany. Listen, really, on Twitter and other social media, we hear every day thousands of lies. Everybody can confirm, right? It's as if you were hearing that Belgium attacked Germany many, many times. So many, many lies. And isn't it that they actually want us to be wary? They want us to be wary. They want you to be wary, right? It is aimed at this wariness when you are confronted with lies and intolerance and all those negative emotions in the social media. But listen, I'm a great Star Wars fan, actually. I love Star Wars. And there is a certain idea of that you have to know the difference between good and evil in Star Wars. And the last part, the ninth episode, there is this wonderful scene when the rebellions do not have any army anymore, so only the citizens come, the citizens of the Republic. And there is this beautiful dialogue between the 2 Imperium soldiers. One says, what is this? This is not an army. And the other says, this is not an army, sir. Those are just people. So this is it, basically. It's about having the the resilience to answer and answer and answer again.
Yeah, I'll try to connect a couple of questions. So regarding the efficiency, to be honest, I think that we don't need to invent the bicycle. I love democracy. Democracy is great. I don't see, and that's why I was telling that there's something with this public perception and debate that as if it is so attacked that we are like on the defensive. There are things that need to be fixed. We also need to say that democracy is not perfect. None of the democracies. And it's a never-going like aspiration in trying to improve things. We see something like in social affairs, we need to fix it. There are like laws which are like need to be improved in terms of disabled people. We need to fix it. There are some people which are, and that's what makes democracy great, that it's about this like process and constant conversation. There's a problem which needs to have action and we need to respond to it. And I think that the autocracies in this regard are very poor. They lack substance. They are just seeding mistrust, chaos. They are attacking on us. And therefore, like, instead of like dealing only with the consequences, and here's the problem with all this disinformation thing, we have this trend of disinformation means that we need to do the like counter like disinformation, that we need to do myth busting rather than media literacy. In fact, we need to do more critical thinking. And you know, I'll just give you one example, because there's also a word, nationalism. I lecture nationalism and ethnicity at the university, and like we had a debate with the students. Students said like that we have a concern that 11th of March, Day of Independence of Lithuania, is usually hijacked by the radical right. And we have just a few dozens. Compared to the other Baltic countries, we don't even have a party like of the and I said like, so why wouldn't we do this, that we will collect different ethnic groups, Lithuanian Jews, Lithuanian like Poles, Lithuanian like old believers, saying that we are Lithuanians, we are celebrating, and we did that basically within, students came up after the lecture, said like, let's do that, and just it took for us 3 weeks to organize a massive like demonstration. And we were all there in the media, and this like radical right folks, a few dozens, looked like a minority. So I think that democracy generally, we are not doing that bad. I mean, prosperity-wise, compared to most of the authoritarian countries, we are in fact rather good. Happiness-wise, happiness index-wise, we are. People are migrating to Europe, to Euro-Atlantic community. So there are things to be happy about that, but sometimes maybe we need just to change the rhetoric.
Well, I'm compelled to have one comment, and that is to recognize that people struggle to make rational decisions, or as neuroscientists would say, 20% of our decisions are probably rational. The rest are instinctive and emotional. But on the efficiency, and in a way also back to this idea of social inequality and division, I think ultimately, democracy is a self-correcting system. Of course, we develop fault lines and etc., but the system's strength is ability to self-correct. Authoritarian systems do not do that. They stand, they make mistakes. When something starts to appear, they repress until they fall apart. There's a disaster, and there's something new to be done. So in that sense, we're always going to be more tactically at a disadvantage. Of course, dictator makes the decisions like that. We never do that. But at the longer run, it's important. The trouble I have is right now is because of the pace of change of the world is so fast and is actually picking up, and social inequality is one of the outcomes of that. Is this democracy that we know are able to adjust as fast, or we have to think a bit more about this? And that is where I am worried.
Thank you. So, yeah, actually, as a German, everybody expected from me to finish punctually, but I promise you that you get the mic. And for a last comment, and if you promise to be less than 20 seconds, okay, then for 2 last comments, please.
I will try really fast. Over there is written, which is, in your opinion, are the biggest threat to democracy in our time? And 2 of the top ones is disinformation and populism, which in my opinion is not a threat to democracy, it is democracy. Populism is an obvious part of it because that's what you would employ in order to get elected. You would appeal to the masses. Isn't it that there is a problem, intrinsic problem with democracy, like everybody gets a vote? You don't have to pass a license to vote, like a driver's license or something of that sort. Children still cannot vote, or not even their parents can have a mandate to vote for their children. Isn't there so much more added value what we can do to enhance democracy, to eliminate those elements from democracy rather than trying to save the type of democracy we currently have? We can evolve it and make it better with technology coming in. We can make more snappier decisions in your voters election app or something like that. It's yeah, shouldn't we like enhance democracy rather than save it as is?
Okay, thank you. And the very last comment for this discussion?
Yes, Carolina, I love your experiment, and I just want to ask your book, the book. I call it an experiment, really good. So in this fashion, tips and tricks to go from a cancel culture to a culture of dialogue.
Okay, so 30 seconds for the last comment for the speakers. Now I'm German. Carolina.
My idea of the German culture, and I have lived there long really, is that you have rules, and then, no, but there is an exception. It always works like this in Germany. Okay, so
it is.
Very quickly. I ran out of my pen, and I couldn't note all the questions. So I will tips for the from cancel culture to culture of dialogue. So in my case, it also started, the Wigura Terlikowski book started also with this, I will not tolerate this. And what was it? It was exactly a program on the radio where just after the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland decided there is a total abortion ban, and Tomasz Terlikowski was together with a liberal journalist, and they were discussing abortion. And the arguments went this way. You liberals torture the unborn babies, and you kill them. And the other side went, you torture women and their bodies. And I was like, is this really happening? Cannot really better arguments be formulated in this discussion? Are we really, do we have to tolerate this? And could please my liberal side formulate better arguments, because the argument with torturing, of course, has two sides. And so I thought, okay, so who does it? Well, I do it. And so I called Tomasz. At the time, by the way, we were on the same program, television program, but not on politics, on culture. And I said, Tomasz, you know, let's stop talking in between the recordings of this program. Let's just record 11 discussions and let's just have a book. So there is this, I will not tolerate, and then what can I do about it, right? And each of us will have a different solution, but I do believe that it's possible. Anecdotically, when we travel with Tomasz to meet our readers, we sometimes go by car. And my husband is panically afraid of cars. He thinks that one can very easily die in a car accident. So he usually asks, Carolina, so who is going to drive? And I say, Tomasz Terlikowski. Oh, then it's not a problem. So you can see how from a complete fight of two worldviews, you can go to trust and saying that, no, this guy is very safe. He's fine. He will drive very safely. I trust him. So this is basically it. It's I will not tolerate, make the first step, but remember, there is a human with a face on the other side. And I say with a face because this is this beautiful metaphor of Levinas, who tells us, if we want to learn respect, we have to look at the other human being and see a face. Let me perhaps stop now, because I think I will now give a chance. See, I was making notes, and now I'm dominating everybody.
No, this is perfect. The final, I think these are the perfect final words, and I would like to come to an end. It's about trust, it's about respect, it's about dignity, and it's about being open for other opinions. And thank you, Ačiū, dziękuję, Lietsvaldies, thank you for your attention and taking part in listening to us today, and be open to other opinions.
Danke, Markus.